Let me just start out by giving you an image. This is J.J. Hill. I'm sure that most of you are vaguely familiar with him. He's one of the most famous railway men of the age. My presentation today is actually based upon a little bone I have to pick with his primary American biographers. In case you haven't figured out from my thick accent, I'm Canadian, as was J.J. Hill, until he actually took out U.S. citizenship at a crucial moment in his career. Hill's biographers and the leading expert on the Great Northern Railway, they have concluded, among other things, they did a wonderful job in almost all their work, but they came to the conclusion that J.J. Hill was a bull-headed fool when it came to the Canadian Pacific Railway and his rivalry with it, and because of that, blew off. Now you have to remember, I'm talking early $1900 here. Blew off approximately $37 million because of his foolhardy competition with the Canadian Pacific Railway. I beg to differ. I don't disagree with the numbers on the amount of money that was eventually invested in Canada, and probably most of that did not end up making much in the way of returns. If you were to follow it, Hill dies in 1916. If you were to follow the history of the Great Northern in Canada and its subsidiaries, and unfortunately I've spent way too much time going through all of their records, I can tell you about the trail of red ink that does flow. But my argument is, it's not because of his bullheadedness, it's not because he was stupid. It was because of a perfect storm of situation that he had no control over. In fact, I argue that what Hill really did was make a series of very, very smart business decisions that in this one particular set of circumstances just did not work for him. So I want to take you through this, and I'm going to use, Hill had interests in Manitoba and in terms of Canadian provinces, and then primarily Manitoba and a little bit in Alberta and primarily British Columbia, right? I'm going to focus on Manitoba. Now, just as a little bit of background, here I have for you this image of Hill at the very, very peak of his powers. And of course, many of you have probably visited the Hill House on Summit. It's gorgeous. Now, you can interpret Hill in a lot of ways. He is in some ways, as my clever little slide points out, kind of the epitome, as modern historians would refer to it as settler colonialism. Here's a poster of him. This is from his company. This is Great Northern. And I believe it's from 1909, offering to sell Indian land. Not mentioning that earlier on in his career, he'd also dealt in some scrip that was not supposed to be in white folks' hands, but he purchased it legally, right? But he really is, most modern historians would see him as this great exemplar of settler colonialism. And in fact, and of course, unfortunately, I have it out of sequence, but he also set up a series of farms. Part of it, he just loved farming, and he loved having produce from his own farm, but he also set them up as experimental stations so that he could help incoming settlers figure out the best crops to raise. And he was also one of those, I don't know if folks have ever heard of this or not, he was one of those who was involved in the quest for the hybrid cow. The cow that was both the beef cow and gave milk. And this is a legit thing, right? There were many people who worked on it. He actually used I'll show you an image of his family farm at one point. But J.J. Hill, I just want to give you a little bit more background on him before I launch into my really boring part. He was fortunate enough, he came from what at the time was called Upper Canada, present-day Ontario. He was born in 1838. The family was not terribly prosperous. The family was on sort of a hard scrabble piece of land. They did not that well on the farm. In fact, it was so hard scrabble that they ended up leaving the farm, leasing it out, and moving to nearby town, where the father ran a tavern, basically. Hill was fortunate enough to actually go to this Rockwood Academy. This is a day and age before wide-scale public education. And by all accounts, including J.J. Hill's, this was the place that made him. He went until 9th grade, which back in the day was not bad at all. right? To get, for a farm kid to get a ninth grade education was quite something. And this place had a headmaster who Hill stayed in contact with his entire life. In fact, ended up bringing him to St. Paul to vacation with his family. He just loved this guy. He just felt that he had given him so much. Now, his formal education ends in grade 9. He's 14 years old. His father died. So he goes to work. Hill starts working in local stores, starts learning his trade, learns bookkeeping firsthand, learns about ordering, learns also that freight was a big component cost of things coming into this small town, right? He was very interested in this sort of stuff. 18 years of age, he decides he's going to go explore the world. He takes off. This is the young man on the make, 1856, so 18 years of age. Now, this is a cautionary note. Don't believe everything Wikipedia tells you. You go to his Wikipedia page and they'll tell you about his travels before he ends up at St. Paul, right? We are going to get to St. Paul pretty quickly. But among other things, they have him working as a bookkeeper down in the southern United States. Never happened. Never happened. I don't know why. I mean, surely someone should have fact-checked. In any event, he does spend time in the eastern United States traveling around. He was in New York and he got pickpocketed, part of the New York experience. Fortunately, he had not kept all of his money. He had, and this is actually an impressive sum, he, by all accounts, had $600 saved up from his time working. And he had that in his dungarees. He only lost a small part of it, apparently. So he ends up in St. Paul. What's important for our purposes is this. He almost immediately started working on the docks, not as a longshoreman, but basically as a clerk. Now, of course, St. Paul is the head of navigation on the Mississippi. St. Paul is just beginning to take off, and he's there for all the action. Now, according to most stories, including some letters from Hill, he had actually hoped to be able to, well, first of all, his real dream was to go out to the Far East. He wanted to go to the Orient, and he wanted to take part in the sealskin trade, right? But then secondarily, he wanted to go up to Red River. Now, let me just go back for a second. While he was here at Rockwood Academy, according to his biographer, his first biographer, the one who actually had a chance to speak to him because they were of the same age, this fellow by the name of Pyle said that when Hill was here at Rockwood, now this is not a completely exclusive school, it's not like Upper Canada College, which is the private school in Ontario, but this was becoming pretty well known. There were kids who'd been sent from Red River to go study here by their parents. And so he, according to Pyle, always knew about the West, and particularly the area that nowadays we refer to as the Winnipeg area, the Red River settlement. So perhaps his contact, and it is true, according to Hill himself, that his goal when he went to St. Paul was to hook up with the then still running Red River cart brigades. He wanted to get up and somehow or other get involved in this trade. If he couldn't make it to the Orient, he was going to make it up to the Northwest. Well, he got there too late in the season. And so he starts working, I will say immediately, as basically a skilled bookkeeper. He had already had some training. And he is going to spend a good decade working for other people. But he learns the ins and outs of the freight trade, both the overland trade and the riverboat trade. He learns every aspect of it. He's very, very careful and learns quickly and well. Well, I want to introduce you very quickly to Norman Kitson. You might have been in his county. Norman Kitson is, you see, an early rival, then an important partner. I should put an early rival, partner. J.J. Hill could be a little fickle in his business dealings with people at times. He would cut you off and then come back and get involved. But Kitson is an important figure in Hill's life. While Hill is still working for other transportation companies, for steamboat companies and handling the bills of lading and doing all the ordering, things like that, Kitson is this crucial figure. Kitson was the fellow who was the bane of the existence of the Hudson Bay Company, because Kitson had the chutzpah to launch his private fur trade post just across the recently established Canada-US border. at Pembina. And the free traders, remember the Hudson Bay Company had a monopoly on all trade. The free traders, particularly the mixed blood, the Métis, would come down to Pembina and trade with him. He became not fabulously wealthy, but this was the basis of his experience. Well, he too is a Canadian expatriate. What's interesting is, like any smart businessman, there comes a point where Kitson actually works a deal with his rival, the Hudson Bay Company. And he starts handling transportation for them. Only problem was the Hudson Bay Company said, you want to handle our transportation? This is also already getting on into the 1860s. You want to handle our transportation? You can't handle anything for the free traders. He turns to this bright young man who's making quite a name for himself by all accounts. He's already become a figure in the local business community. He doesn't own much yet, but he's the go-to guy for business, right? Turns to this young man, about 1864, and says, would you like to handle the free trade component? Because I can't do it anymore. I'll lose my lucrative contract with the Hudson Bay Company. He goes, sure. That's his first contact with Red River. Doesn't go there yet. But then Kitson tells him about the incredible opportunities up at Red River. There's already farming operations going on. And he also tells him that the whole way up, this Red River Valley, the Red River of the North, the land is incredibly rich. Tremendous potential for settlement. And of course, if there's tremendous potential for settlement, there's tremendous potential for transportation services, for land sales, the whole enchilada. He's intrigued. Well, he keeps on, the young man, Hill, keeps on developing his business skills. He goes out on his own, then forms a couple of partnerships with another Griggs, not the one that we're all familiar with, not Alexander, but originally with Chauncey Griggs in St. Paul. And among other things, they get into the coal and cordwood business. Of course, cordwood was what everyone used to cook with and heat things, and in fact, cordwood was being used for the first railways to run the steam engines. It's in the coal trade, working out of St. Paul. He actually comes up with a plan to corner the market on all coal coming into St. Paul. He comes like that close to doing it completely. It's one of his first sources of real independent money. But Canada, he'd been fascinated by it for a while. And since the mid-1860s, he's been making money off that Red River trade. He sees tremendous potential. Many of you will know that in 1869-70, there was a wee bit of unpleasantness just on the Canadian side of the border. It's the first Riel Rebellion. Now, Kitson, who's got ties back in Canada, has become this sort of local persona. He's almost like an unofficial consul general for Canada. Prominent Canadians coming through actually stop and see him. And the winter of 1869-70, there's a steady stream. Who shows up at his door? By this time, he is married, and he's got a fairly substantial house, not the one on Summit yet. Who stops by? A fellow by the name of McDougall, who has in his pocket the warrant declaring him to be governor of the about-to-be-proclaimed Canadian territory that's going to become Manitoba. He stops and talks to Hill. As this deal does not work out, he's going to be pushed back by Riel. He never actually takes control. Later on that same winter, after the Riel Rebellion is broken out, who comes traipsing through and just around Christmas time stops at the Hill House for dinner? Donald Smith, the chief factor of the Hudson Bay Company, who's been sent by the Canadian government to try to negotiate an end to the Riel Rebellion. He is so curious, and he's heard so much about the potential of Red River, that in the spring of 1870, there's still a lot of snow on the ground. Sorry. Yeah, newsflash, right? That's part of the world. He takes the train as far as he can, which at this point was St. Cloud, and then starts going overland and is going to make it all the way up to Red River in March of 1870. He's going to survey the situation. He's also going to check out the quality of the land, things like this place he's been dealing with. But he's also working as an informant for the Canadian government. We have copies of his letters and telegrams sent to the Canadian Secretary of the Provinces, Joseph Howe, So he's actually wearing many hats. But he also, in his own letters, his own writings, indicates that he's going up there as sort of a representative of the St. Paul business community to scope out the possibilities of this territory. Now, we all live in a world where we know that across the 49th parallel, it's Manitoba. Always has been, always will be. Well, 1869, 1870, not so sure. Was Louis Riel going to be willing to work a deal with the American government? There were some folks, and some of you may actually know some of these names. Eno Stutzman, one of the most interesting lawyers you'll ever come across. Consul Taylor, working up in what's nowadays Winnipeg, trying to convince Riel, and one of Riel's chief lieutenants is an Irishman by the name of O'Donoghue, who's a Fenian and wants the US to annex all that territory. So there's a lot going on here. And our young man is going to go up and check it out himself. Well, he writes some fascinating accounts of this. One of them, for those of you who like historical trivial pursuits, he actually told part of his story as a speech that he gave at University of North Dakota, and it was then printed in the University of North Dakota. It was at the time called the Quarterly Journal, I believe it was, in 1911, this story of his heroic trip up to Red River. What is very, very clear is he comes back from that trip, and his information that he provided to Joseph Howe, it's like, I'm going, oh, yeah, I don't think you really know exactly what was going on with the native tribes. Maybe you saw some of what was going on with the Métis, but First Nations, who did you contact? But no matter the quality of that information, his information on the potential of the Red River Valley had been solidified. That very summer, 1870, he starts working with, well, he's actually going to go behind Kitson's back. Kitson, among other things, in partnership with the Hudson Bay Company, had purchased a steamboat, the International, to make use of the now rail link that's about to be established by 1872 into Fargo. Use the Red River coming down from Fort Garry, you have this great link, right? Kitson had, with the Hudson Bay Company, purchased a steamer and a couple of barges, and were making use of the Red River as a transportation route. Hill, remember, he's still in partnership. He's still picking up all the what was left of the free trade stuff from Kitson. Hill decides, I'm going to go to another Griggs, this time ours, Alexander, an experienced riverboat man. No, by the way, no relation to Chauncey Griggs, although his first biographer said he was, but they're not. I've read the obituaries. This is Alexander Griggs. And they are going to construct, although when you read Hill's letters, who constructed the Selkirk? James J. Hill. Griggs' name is not mentioned in his correspondence about building this, but in any event, they build the Selkirk, and they're going to start taking part in this riverboat trade. It's a roaring success. It's so successful that the Hudson Bay Company, headed by Donald Smith, a name that comes up again, and you're going to see an image of him pretty soon, he's really ticked off, because this is and Kitson, we don't have any record of what Kitson thought, but he must have been going, my young protege, what's he doing? Well, they're so successful that within a year, the Hudson Bay Company and Kitson decide to offer Hill and Griggs a partnership with them. And they, by January of 1872, are in the process of constructing the most complete monopoly on steamboat trade you can imagine. There's a company that tries to get going in 1875. It's actually, the charter points out that it's St. Paul and Winnipeg businessmen who want to break this monopoly, because of course when you have a monopoly, the freight charge is going to be higher. Well, they drive them out of business within less than a season and end up getting hold of their vessels as well. Very, very rough businessmen. And here, this is Hill's Red River steam-powered paddleboat, the Selkirk. It's from 1871. And this, of course, I mentioned this is the International, the one that Kitson had owned, right, along with the Hudson Bay Company. Well, of course, it results in rivalry, but then pretty soon after, this new partnership with Kitson. From this point onwards, the Kitson-Hill association never falters. Never falters. Now I want to introduce you to a couple of interesting characters. This distinguished looking man, I was just thinking of it as J.S. Kennedy, because that's the way he's always referred to. J.S. Kennedy, he is indeed the money man behind Hill's takeover of that crucial bit of infrastructure that's going to be the basis of his wealth and the start of the Great Northern Railway. It's originally called the St. Paul and Pacific Railway. It's had a charter for a number of years. It's got a lovely land grant. Whenever anyone tells you J.J. Hill did it the hard way, unlike the other railway companies, he never got any land grants. That's a crock. Because he takes over all the land grants of this railway. And they're going to be, they're not over bare, bald prairie. Sorry, no disrespect. But not going through certain parts of North Dakota or Manitoba where the land might not be worth quite as much. It's going through the heart of the Red River Valley. It's valuable, valuable land. This guy is a financial genius. When this railway is, and I'll talk a little more, when this railway, the St. Paul, and it's going to become the St. Paul, Minneapolis, Manitoba, the core of the Great Northern. When he and Kitson start taking it over fully in 1878, Hill's net worth, estimated by everyone who has any insight into this, was at most $150,000. Now, that's a lot of money at the time. That would have been enough to retire on quite comfortably. But those of you who know anything about railways, that is a drop in the bucket, right? 150,000. Kitson would have had probably the same amount. And somehow or other, they're going to come up with $5 million to get this railway. And it's this man who actually is the financial genius behind arranging this. But also, George Stephan. He too is involved with the St. Paul and Pacific. Let me just go ahead for a second. This man, Donald Smith, who I've mentioned a couple of times, chief factor of the Hudson Bay Company for a while, guy who sent out to negotiate with Riel, also the guy who was running the transportation business on behalf of the HBC with Kitson. He is going to also be part of this partnership to buy this railway. This man, Smith, is the cousin of George Stephan. Stephan has one very interesting little connection. Among other things, he's the president of the Bank of Montreal. And he's not the owner, but he too, now I mentioned Kennedy as this financial genius who's actually going to help get all this stuff going. George Stephan, some of his critics later said, did you really have the proper securities for the loans that you gave to those railways? And no, he did not. But he was able to use influence with the board and get this deal done. It's an incredibly, incredibly complex process that is going to lead to this group, we call them. So here we have, you've already met, well, I'm not going to go back to Kitson, but Kitson, John Stuart Kennedy, George Stephan, Donald Smith, and our hero, J.J. Hill, are just the associates. They're the 5 associates. Kennedy is never named in any of the documents as an associate. But when they're splitting up the shares, the value of this new railway company, the unnamed 5th goes to J.S. Kennedy. Why was he unnamed? Well, because he was also representing the Dutch bondholders from whom Hill and the associates purchased the rail line. It might have been a wee bit of a conflict of interest, but it all worked out well, at least for Hill. And these folks go into business and they are going to, well, here's another image. This is Western Canada's very first locomotive is brought up to Winnipeg, St. Boniface, by steamboat and one of Hill's steamboats, right? We're starting to enter into the railway age. And Hill always understood that all his domination of the steamboat industry was but precursor to the really important one. He saw the day of steamboating, and particularly on the Red, as being almost past. Now, I know you could say, well, if we look at the Mississippi and the Missouri, steamboating lasts for a very long time. It's very important, right? We still see barge traffic on the Mississippi today. I would only say, look at the Red River in late summer of a dry year. I'm sure some of you in this room have seen the Red River at a point where you could walk across certain parts of it. Imagine trying to bring heavy loads out during a dry summer. So he always knew that he was going to be going into railways. Now, as soon as he gets a hold of that contract, gets a hold of the company that's going to become the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, he starts constructing this line. You can see at the very bottom here, this line that's going to run up, it's an extension running up to St. Vincent and right across the border from Emerson, Manitoba. What he can't do, he's not going to be allowed to build the line from Winnipeg down to St. Boniface. Instead, that's part, at the time, the Canadian Pacific company that we're familiar with had not been fully formed yet. There is a Canadian Pacific that is sort of owned by the Canadian government, and it has contracted to build a branch, and they're not going to let an American control it. But rest assured, who does have effective control? Donald Smith and his cousin George Stephan. So that link is going to be crucial. This rail line is completed, and Hill only owns 1/5, but he is also the general manager. So he's running the day-to-day operations. That line that we see running from Winnipeg down to Emerson, and then that line that is part of the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, that is the basis of all of J.J. Hill's wealth. Now, I just want you to imagine this. So this line is up and running. In fact, although Hill's not allowed to own it by parliamentary rule in Canada, he actually sent a whole bunch of his own work crews over the line to make sure that the Canadian section is finished, right, in time. From 1879 until the first transcontinental rail line in Canada is completed technically in 1885. I'm sure you've all heard Gordon Lightfoot and about the building of the Canadian Railway. Well, the thing is that the line is not completed all the way across. When military forces had to be sent out west for the second rail rebellion of 1885, the railway wasn't completed. They had to get off and walk parts of it. So we don't have the first train that actually runs transcontinentally until 1886. From 1879 to 1886, it's the Hill Line that is carrying everything up to this rapidly booming town. Oh, by the by, including all the materials to build the railway that's going to be the Canadian Pacific. It's the only way in. It's the only rail line in. Now, does anyone remember what I said Hill's net worth was when he was first negotiating for takeover of this little rail line? $150,000, yeah, so that would have been roughly 1877, 78. By 1885, his net worth was estimated at $5 million on the basis of this railway. And these other guys, I just have to go back to this. Donald Smith, who's going to become Lord Strathcona, Sir George Stephan, they're going to become fabulously wealthy. Almost every biographer of theirs is agreed, and both of them have a couple of biographers. They're huge figures in Canadian economic and political history, that the majority of their wealth came from the Hill railway lines. Incredibly successful. Well, so I hope you're getting this image that Hill's a pretty smart guy. He knows how to make money, but he also always had this vision from, I guess maybe you could argue, maybe even from the schoolboy days. He'd always seen part of the future as the Northwest, and he didn't differentiate about a silly line on a map. Although he was willing to use that line on the map. One of my favorite stories about Hill, remember, he's a Canadian. He doesn't take out U.S. citizenship till 1880. When he's involved in that first battle for control over Red River boating, he's at that point a rival with his dear old friend Kitson and the Hudson Bay Company. He reaches out to the Canadian or the American Department of Immigration and Customs, or its predecessor, and says, I believe that the Hudson Bay Company is sending goods to Red River that aren't properly bonded, and they're not an American company. He actually shuts them out for several, Donald Smith, and they're not really good friends, they've met a few times, but he goes, oh, I'm sure he used a rough word, but then he later said, pretty doggone clever. But the irony is, the Hudson Bay Company and Smith turns over ownership to Kitson, because by this time Kitson has become an American citizen. In fact, Kitson had been the mayor of St. Paul at one point, right? He's American up the wazoo. Hill, still not an American citizen, but his company was registered in the United States. So he's willing to use this stuff, right? He understands, once again, scholars would refer to him as sort of this transnational character, right? A borderlands figure. But he just knew the rules and how they could best be used by him. Well, but I want to go back to this point. Bear in mind that the source of his wealth has been his correct understanding of the potential of the West. He has not faltered in that. And it's made him quite wealthy. He also, I just have to point this out to you. Any of you who've ever been, my kids all live in the cities. I've been over the Stone Arch many times. You'll oftentimes hear the phrase, Jim Hill's folly. And it refers to a number of things. This is his first folly, building this Stone Arch Bridge over the Mississippi in 1883. It's way too expensive. We can't afford this sort of thing. It's still standing. It became fabulously successful. I would argue, once again, that almost everything that was ever labeled one of Jim Hill's follies during his lifetime turned to gold. He was a very smart businessman. This, by the way, is one of the family farms. This is where he did some of that experimental stuff. He's a man of many parts. But now we need to consider this. I'm just going to leave his image up for a second. Hill is becoming quite well-to-do. And his friends, Donald Smith, George Stephan, and Kennedy, they want Hill to join them in the greatest adventure in all of Canadian history, the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. J.J. Hill is a founding member of the syndicate that built the Canadian Pacific Railway. Even though, now, part of the deal, and for those of you who don't know, the Canadian Pacific Railway was given, you probably know that the Union Pacific got a really sweet deal when they were building a transcontinental here in the US. I would say the CP had maybe even a better deal. Canadian Pacific Railway, part of their deal, 25 million acres of land, $25 million, and every single mile of rail line that had been completed on the Canadian Pacific plan by the government over the previous years, including the Pembina branch. All of that just turned over. By a conservative estimate, $33 million just in existing rail lines that they got. It's a sweetheart of a deal. Hill joins the syndicate, but he always had this one thing in the back of his mind. I gotta convince my friends, they're reasonable men, they will understand that it is crazy, I tell you, to build a rail line across that God-forsaken stretch of land that they call the Canadian Shield. For those of you who don't know Canadian geography very well, let me just point out that in southern Ontario, they refer to places like, Sudbury, Ontario, as northwestern Ontario. Sudbury, Ontario is about 140 miles south of us. Ontario, part of the Ontario border with the United States is the 45th parallel. Windsor is south of Detroit, for those of you who are curious about these matters. Why, in heaven's name, does it seem that you just stop about 100 miles north of Toronto? You get up to Lake Huron, and particularly Georgian Bay. You get past Georgian Bay and you start hitting nothing but rock. There is going to be no freight traffic essentially from that part of Ontario. And once again, some of you have probably been on the North Superior route. It's a beautiful country. I've driven the Trans-Canada several times, but not so much farmland. And people had not yet found the incredible value that was harnessed in that landscape, right? The precious metals, the pulp and paper industry, the hydroelectric resources. We're still at an age when that stuff was not of great value. Hadn't been harnessed yet. And Hill understood that. Hill understood that no railway could be financially successful if it's built across the middle of a God-forsaken, mountainous, or not, but stony wasteland. Sorry, I hate to say this. Any of you who are from Ontario, I apologize. It's not really a wasteland, but it looks like it. How do you make use of this? And so Hill, in his part of the CP syndicate, he keeps on trying to convince his compatriots that what we really need to do is just build a line from Winnipeg out to Vancouver. And let's use existing American rail lines. Oh, I have one. and George and Donald, you have major shares in it. Why don't we just have the lines link up through existing lines coming down from Southern Ontario? There's a whole network of rail lines already existing. Let's just hook up, and if necessary, we'll buy up some of those lines, right? And then we'll have that. The Canadian National Rail Line, or the Canadian Pacific Railway, will take a little US detour. It makes perfect economic sense, doesn't it? And if you are someone like J.J. Hill, who thinks in economic terms and doesn't really care about the border, it makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, the realities of Canadian politics were not going to happen. You have to build strictly over Canadian territory. And so by 1883, Hill says, sorry guys, I'm out. And he literally cashes in his share of the stocks and walks away from the deal. And then, really from that point onwards, we see him focusing upon the expansion of that rail line that started out just as with that big extension, out of St. Paul and goes up to Emerson. But then he starts developing more Western lines. That's going to become the Great Northern. He also gets involved in a cutthroat rivalry with the Northern Pacific. Difference between J.J. Hill's Great Northern and the Northern Pacific is the Great Northern was well run. The Northern Pacific always suffered from poor management, run by people who didn't know railroading. J.J. Hill knew railroading. And in fact, every one of his biographers makes a point. This is a hands-on guy. When he was general manager of that first rail line, he managed it. He could tell you where every penny was going, right? His bookkeeping was so impeccable that it was once commented by a bank auditor that you could spend 10 minutes looking at one of his financial statements and cover an entire month's work for an entire corporation. It was that well done. It was just all there. So the guy is really kind of a business genius. And he focuses upon his American lines and does quite well. Completes the building out to the West Coast by 1893. And 1893, oh, any history buffs in the room? 1893, why does that date stick in my mind? What happened? Oh, thank you, the panic. In fact, the panic and then the depression that comes after it was so bad that until the 1930s it was called the Great Depression. Unfortunately, it got surpassed by another Great Depression. It is brutal. But you know what J.J. Hill didn't have? Debt. J.J. Hill comes out and he's actually in pretty good shape. Not so much the Northern Pacific. It's going to go bankrupt for the second time in its history and go into receivership. J.J. Hill, like all the great robber barons, knew a bargain when he saw it, and he wants to take over the Northern Pacific. He's kind of short on cash, but he'd love to take it over. The thing is, he's not able. There's still, you can go into bankruptcy without losing everything, right? As you folks probably know if you've watched the saga of Bed Bath & Beyond, how many times they've been in bankruptcy. Well, the thing is that Hill is going to be trying to figure out a way to get a hold of the Northern Pacific, its stock, its shares. Why? Because it is his rival, and he would love to be able to harmonize the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. And I should probably just splash ahead. I'll come back to these guys later. But here, this is the Northern Pacific Railway. Now you can see, now remember, this is his great rival, right? I know I have, there we go. And here's the Great Northern. Notice they're both very, very close to the Canadian border, serving the northern tier, right? Sorry, I should have those two maps right next to each other. Something I just want you to pay attention to. Look at Hill's, that main line. Look at all those things running up to Canada. We're going to come back to this map later on. So here's the Northern Pacific, runs a little bit south, but it has gotten into Manitoba. Now, that's not why Hill is primarily interested, but it is an important part of the story. Now, let me just go back. These two men, William Mackenzie and Donald Mann, while J.J. Hill has been building up his empire, the Great Northern, and trying to figure out a way to get a hold of the Northern Pacific, and he's getting pretty close. It's just unfortunate that J.P. Morgan beat him to it. More on that in a second. But these two guys, they'd been contractors. They had run contracting firms building parts of the CPR, right? Every major railway is going to have contractors working for it. These guys have been pretty successful. Then they got their hands on a couple of small rail lines in Manitoba, largely so they could get a hold of the land grant. But they were railway contractors, so what do? If you're a railway contractor, you build the rail. And they started building more of these little rails, and the Manitoba government loved them because, now imagine, how would the North Dakota government feel about anyone who's building railways into rural North Dakota? You're our friend. We love you. So these guys are going to become quite successful at building these small lines. They become so successful that they are going to be able to create a vision that they're going to build a new transcontinental railway across Canada, the Canadian Northern. And actually, oh boy is right, because it's going to go down in flames. They're going to build it, but they're going to go bankrupt. Henry Villard and the Northern Pacific. This is J.J. Hill's original bête noire, his nightmare, right? The guy he's always fighting against. The guy he always is worried is going to try to get him somehow or other. Well, I say this is the line. Because of the peculiarities of Manitoba politics, this line that you see here, running from Winnipeg down here, that's not the same line. Remember I showed you the Pembina branch? If this was a more detailed map, where if you knew that area quite as well as I did, you would know that the key difference is this line is on the west side of the Red River. The Pembina branch was on the east side. It's hard to tell on this map, right? The Northern Pacific had taken over. Now, something else you probably don't know. The Canadian Pacific, when it was chartered, I remember I told you all the really cool things it was given. There's one other thing I didn't tell you it was given. A monopoly clause. Nobody could build a line south of the Canadian Pacific Railway for over 20 years. It's called, Canadian historians just call it the monopoly clause. You don't have to explain it. We all know it's the monopoly clause. But the people of Manitoba didn't like the idea that they were, because of course, once you have one company running all the transportation, all the railway, who becomes the bad guy all the time? Canadian Pacific is always the enemy because they run this evil monopoly on all trade and traffic coming in and out of the West. A very courageous politician by the name of John Norquay decides he's going to test the monopoly clause, and he actually he's going to have the provincial government help to build a rail line, that rail line that runs, that's labeled the Northern Pacific, running down to the US border. The Canadian Prime Minister of the day, Sir John A. Macdonald, engineers Norquay's complete and utter destruction. Manufactures a financial crisis that didn't exist, over bonds held by Mackenzie and Mann for railway construction. It's a completely bogus case. And Norquay is out, his successor comes in, and at this point, the Macdonald government goes, well, we can't really keep this monopoly clause going forever. They give another sweetheart deal to the CPR to be willing to give up the monopoly clause, and Manitoba is going to get its line running down to the border. And who do they turn to build it? The Northern Pacific. Only problem is this. The Northern Pacific goes bankrupt. And its Manitoba branch is really just a subsidiary. But here, they were pretty serious. This is a really bad picture. I just like it because it's got the street scene in front of it. But at the back, it's always referred to as the palatial Manitoba. Don't worry, I've got a better picture. Whoa. This is it. This is the Manitoba Hotel built in 1889. The Northern Pacific was putting money into this venture, right? Because Winnipeg was the city of the future. It's the place. They're just going great guns. Unfortunately, it burns down in 1897. Or no, 1899, sorry, yeah. And it's interesting. The Northern Pacific, remember, I told you it's gone into receivership, bankruptcy. Well, the weird thing is, The Canadian branch is sort of allowed to run on its own volition for a while. And then when it comes into receivership, the strangest thing of all happens. This man, John Pierpont Morgan. Some of you may be familiar with the term, something gets Morganized. Morganized. J.P. Morgan was the financial genius of the age. You could love him or hate him, but the man was brilliant. And as I always tell my students, when J.P. Morgan stepped in to deal with a bankrupt company, and he specialized in railway companies, but also, you may have heard another little corporation he helped to form, U.S. Steel. Yeah. But his deal always was, the House of Morgan would come in, and they'll rescue you. They'll figure out a way to get you back up into business. We'll get this going. We'll probably look after your stockholders and stuff. But you give us stocks in your company and control of the board of directors. Never less than 2 seats on the board of directors, and usually with veto power. That people at the time referred to it as being Morganized. And J.P. Morgan, who actually worked with J.J. Hill, does something rather strange, at least from my perspective. I remember I told you, J.J. Hill had been trying to get his hands on control of the Northern Pacific for a number of years after it went into receivership. Now, Morgan has stepped in and taken over, but behind the scenes, Hill and his interest have purchased a majority of Northern Pacific stock by the late 1890s. So they, technically speaking, own it, don't they? Except who's running the company? This dude. He doesn't look like the swiftest guy. Not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Charles Sanger Allen, actually, is much smarter than he looks. But he is appointed president of the Northern Pacific Railway by J.P. Morgan. Just imagine how J.J. Hill is feeling in the late 1890s and early 1900s. He's put out all this money. He actually has controlling stock, or it should be controlling stock in the Northern Pacific, but he's not allowed to run it. And it's this guy, and he hates this guy. And this guy does all sorts of things. He sells off some Manitoba assets, including that line running down. And Morgan goes, he's my boy. He's going to do what he's going to do. He remains as president of the Northern Pacific till 1903. I can't even, I'm not wealthy. But if I had the majority stock in a company, I'd be really ticked off that I couldn't control it. And this guy Mellon actually did things that competed with the Great Northern in the US, purposely. Hill was so upset. But finally, Hill's going to get him out, and he will. The Northern Pacific and Great Northern are never merged, right? They're always separate companies. You can walk down to the Heritage Center or the Minnesota Historical Society where the archives are kept, and the records of both the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific are there. You're going to find a lot of correspondence from J.J. Hill in both sets. So now, what has changed that's going to make Hill decide he is desperate to get back into Canada? In fact, in my notes, I have, meanwhile, back in Canada. Now, you folks are a very good crowd. Someone already identified there was this major financial panic, 1893, right? And as I mentioned, it became the Great Depression of the 1890s. What you may not know is the Great Depression started lifting earlier in Canada than it did in the United States. Most US economic historians date the end of the depression that came out of that panic as 1897, some cases early 1898. Canadian historians, it's all over 1896. Why? We start seeing this phenomenal boom of immigration. After a decade of relatively slow-paced economic growth, particularly in the West, the Canadian economy takes off like topsy. Just everything goes Canada's way. In fact, it starts marketing itself as the last best West. All that lovely land out in the prairies is going to be sold off. And we're going to see what is always referred to in Canadian historical terms as the Great Laurier Wheat Boom. Now, I just have to give you some census years. Unfortunately, we didn't have a census in 1896, but 1901 census, and then they did a midpoint census in 1916 for the prairie provinces. So 1901 to 1916, Canada It's going through a phenomenal rate of growth. Grew by 49% in terms of population. Not too shabby. The three prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, grew by 400%. Where is most of the Canadian growth occurring? Out here on the prairies. And what are you growing on the prairies? Wheat. And what do you need to transport wheat? Railways. This is my first absolute proof positive that J.J. Hill knew what he was doing. He looked at the Canadian wheat economy at this period and goes, I'd always had this vision. I've always been trying to tap into the market. Now I know I have to get into it. And damn that Northern Pacific. They got rid of the lines just when I wanted them most. But by 1903, he has perfected control over the Northern Pacific. Morgan has finally allowed him to get rid of Mellon, and so he's got his own man in. He can do what he wants. But the problem is, the Northern Pacific had given up that line already that ran down to the Canadian border. The center of everything in the Canadian West, and I say this not just because I'm a born and bred Winnipegger, but because it's true. Winnipeg was the Chicago of the North. Everything went in and out of Winnipeg. You want to control trade in the Canadian West, you need to control Winnipeg. You need to have access to it, you need freight yards, you need the whole 9 yards, right? Hill, let me go back to these two dudes, Mackenzie and Mann. They're the clever guys who got a hold of the Northern Pacific Railway's line going down to the US border. Hill already had a pretty positive relationship with these two dudes. He'd worked with them out in British Columbia. There's a ton of correspondence between them. Some people claim that there was a formal alliance. It's not true. And if I was J.J. Hill's ally, I'd be very nervous because I never know when he's going to become my enemy. But these guys have that rail line that links into Winnipeg. Hill and his companies start a process of negotiating for control, not full-blown control, but running rights. But really detailed running rights so that they could make use of that line at any time. They would actually have, the deal that they worked out gave them priority over Mackenzie and Mann's own railway company for using that line. Now, it's a very, very detailed set of negotiations. And what's interesting to me is this. Hill always has this vision that he wants to open things up. He wants to get access. Now, this is a misleading picture because it focuses on passenger traffic. Hill always knew that you had to have provisions for passenger traffic, but that's not where the money is in railways, right? It's freight. But make great images. They're great propaganda pieces. And people who live in cities like Winnipeg want to hear that not only are you going to be doing more freight, but you're going to have more passenger service. We're going to be connected to the rest of the world really quickly and really well with sexy new railways. The CPR. The CPR, and this is where Hill's American biographers do have kind of a point. The Canadian Pacific Railway has been, and here's that route, the north of Superior route, right, that was so uneconomic. Well, of course, the CPR have been pretty heavily subsidized, and it has a virtual monopoly for a number of years. It's able to survive. But look at this. Look at those extensions down south. Well, here, coming out of Winnipeg, of course, that's the original Soo line, called because eventually it's going to go up and go across Sault Ste. Marie. But then, in 1904-05, the CPR announces that it's going to build an extension going westwards. For those of you who don't know, that's North Dakota. It's going to build, now already, Hill's a little ticked off about that line that cuts into what he sees as his territory, right down to here, just parallel to his line. But now, that doggone extension, and it's always from Thief River to Kenmare, North Dakota. The heart, let me go back to the heart of his territory. Remember, he's got two rail lines. He's got the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern. So Hill goes, first of all, the Canadian market's really worthwhile. And second, the doggone CPR is trying to take me on. Now, at this point, Hill has brought he's trying to back away from some of the business, and he has brought his second oldest son into the business. His first son had sort of a nervous breakdown. He'd been the original chosen one. But his second son, Louis, decides that we need, and with his father's approval, we need to develop this Canadian strategy. He wrote to his father, and this is 1906. It would be a waste of money for either the Great Northern or the Northern Pacific, there are two railways, to build a line parallel to the Sioux line. I believe that the same mileage in Manitoba would bring results much quicker. I wired you today suggesting that Colonel Lamont open up negotiations with the Canadian Northern Railway and either get running rights to Winnipeg, over that line I pointed out to you, or acquire the exclusive use of the Winnipeg line, but possibly, if the matter was carefully thought over, it might be considered well to buy the Canadian Northern lines entirely, the Mackenzie and Mann lines. Buy the whole enchilada. In that, it goes into detail. It says, the Canadian Northern, they're not really very effective businessmen. They don't run the line very, very well. We could make a profit out of it. But the thing is that the market is so important, we need to get it. Somehow or other, we need to. If we're going to both expand, but also take on the CPR. So it's 2 points, right? Both expansion and taking on the CPR. So it's not just Hill Sr., but his son is fully behind this. And we're going to see over the next few years, and I know I'm running late, so I'm going to make this pretty fast. Next couple of years, Hill and his representatives negotiate with Mackenzie and Mann like crazy to get a hold of that, to get the running rights on that line. The problem is Mackenzie and Mann want so many things because they've decided to build a transcontinental. And they keep on asking for more concessions. For example, because Hill controls the Northern Pacific, they would really like to have access into Duluth, which the Northern Pacific had. And so the negotiations, they become incredibly complicated. But Hill keeps on trying. And so here we have the challenge coming from CPR. Among other things, Hill, using the Northern Pacific, which still had charters and charter rights, starts chartering a whole bunch of new companies, including the Midland Railway Company of Manitoba. It's eventually going to become the Great Northern of Manitoba. And here's Winnipeg in 1906. Look at that. Some kind of toddling town, the Chicago of the North. It's growing. It is the center of all trade. And now, actually, I lied to you in that. I said in 1906. I should have said in 1905-06. This man, James Fisher, who is Hill's Winnipeg lawyer, well, actually, he's designated as the lawyer for the Northern Pacific. He is deputized to start buying land very quietly. That's why 1905 is important, because before any announcements are made about his plans, Fisher starts buying up land for a new freight yard and perhaps a passenger depot in Winnipeg. He puts together, between 1905 and 1906, and once again, you have to remember I'm talking about millions of dollars when this really mattered, when millions were something. He spent in excess of $2 to $2.5 million on land for a freight yard. Hill is really, really serious about this, right? Now, of course, why do you do it quietly? If people know what you're doing, they're going to jack up the prices, right? So this package is already put together. And then after that process already started, Hill, who's trying to put pressure on Mackenzie and Mann to give him these running rights, I just love this. Hill shows up in Winnipeg. Hasn't been to Winnipeg in 18 years. Shows up in Winnipeg and he's feted, right? He is just this, he's this huge success. People have forgotten what a schmuck he was when he had the outright monopoly on transportation. Now he's a hero. And what does he announce? I'm contemplating building a new rail line from Vancouver to Winnipeg. Winnipeg goes nuts. And of course, it's like, oh my goodness, they're going to have a freight yard, and that's why he started buying the land early, right? And another passenger depot. Oh my God, we really are the Chicago of the North. This is phenomenal. Now, whether or not Hill meant he really was going to build that line is another matter. But here's where things get really complicated. Sorry, I know it's already been complicated. But Hill and his interests decide that we can't really afford, we're not gonna have enough passenger traffic that we would want our own separate passenger terminal. We need the freight yards, for sure. But passenger terminal, so he's gonna want to work with some other companies, a union terminal. And folks, this is the 1908 plan for this beautiful, beautiful union terminal, still there in Winnipeg. There it is today. If you ever stay at the Fort Garry Hotel, that's what you look out across at. Well, he has to work deals not only with with Mackenzie and Mann and their Canadian Northern Railway, but also he has to work deals with another railway company that's decided to build a new transcontinental as well, the Grand Trunk Pacific, and the Canadian government, who've agreed to help build half of that transcontinental railway. He has to negotiate all of these things. It's incredibly complicated. And he also needs to negotiate this control. This is the line that he's going to get control over, and then he also needs permission to build these junctions up into his proposed freight yards. It's exciting. And negotiations, although they dragged on, finally, in 1911, the negotiating team that Hill has put together, the special assistants to both the presidents of the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern, in constant consultation with him, with Lewis, they've got the Canadian Northern, Mackenzie and Mann, to agree to all their terms, and they start building. They start building the freight yard. So $2.5 million investment now goes up to over $3 million. I want you to consider this for a second. The value of land in Winnipeg has been going up pretty consistently, right? At any time until you start turning over sod, you could sell that land for a profit. You could do pretty well, right? Because the value of land had kept on going up. The second you put a spade in the ground and you start developing the freight yards, all of a sudden, you've only got a freight yard. That's all it can be used for. Once you start all that extensive work. But in 1911, even though they hadn't signed on the dotted line for that extension, for the exclusive running rights, Hill and his negotiating team go, we gotta start construction on the freight yards because the boom is getting greater and greater every day. Oh, and you know what else is going on? We're about to have a free trade agreement. Reciprocity has been announced. President Taft has turned to Canada and said, here, take this. Take free trade in natural goods. You don't even have to give us complete access to your markets for manufactured goods. This is a dream of Canadians from the days that they lost the first reciprocity treaty in the 1860s. It's just handed there. If there had been a Vegas in the day, the odds that this is not going to get through Canadian Parliament and not be accepted, because it's massively popular in most parts of Canada, it's just a done deal. Who could turn this down? And so Hill's interests build the freight yard. They build, so they've got a $3.5 million investment now, and they don't have that deal yet. As one of the executives said, we are facing the possibility of having a completely functional freight yard and no rail line into it. This is not good economics, folks. They need this. Hill is so mad at the delay. He'd at one point, his underlings had come up with a plan to build their own rail line, only 1.3 mil, but still 1.3 million, from Emerson up to Winnipeg. They all pointed out, we won't get any trade at all that distance from Emerson to Winnipeg, but then again, we can haul a lot more coal and stuff. That's a pretty valuable thing. And then the perfect storm hits, and I promise I'm going to wrap up in less than 5 minutes. This man comes along. He looks at the proposed reciprocity treaty that your President Taft has very kindly offered to Canada. And I have to say, because we have, of course, copies of his correspondence. He looks at this promise of reciprocity, and now he wasn't a swearing man, but if he was, he would have said, damn, I'm never going to become leader of the country. He's been leader of the opposition forever, right? Laurier is still, he's not the most popular prime minister, but he's been in power since 1896. And Borden goes, with reciprocity, he's going to be in power until the day he dies. except Borden starts getting advice from some of his other conservative members. There's a hidden logic to the reciprocity treaty. It is beyond doubt, this is Borden, it is beyond doubt that the leading public men of the United States, its leading press, and the mass of its people believe annexation of the Dominion to be the ultimate, inevitable, and desirable result of this proposition. So, economic reciprocity, you accept that, the US is going to swallow us whole. Now, folks, I want to tell you the dirty secret of Canadian political life. Never underestimate the importance of anti-Americanism and its value. You can always stir up a little controversy by saying the Americans are after us. They want our natural. Some of you folks might, well, if you were in Canada in the 1970s, you might have actually seen buttons that said, rather cleverly, Nixon drinks Canada dry. I don't think they were referring to the ginger ale. Just saying a soupçon of anti-Americanism never goes too far awry in Canadian politics. Sorry, don't tell anyone outside of this room. And if you're there on the internet, I didn't say that. It's probably AI. Well, this is going to lead. No, I always feel so bad. Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Liberal Prime Minister of the day, the Conservatives had delayed action. I don't want to get into all the parliamentary procedures, but they delayed voting on approval of this, and were blocking him on every possible turn. And Laurier goes, hey, I got a winning issue. And as you probably know, in the Westminster system, you don't have to wait 4 years for an election. You can call an election when you want. Laurier calls an election thinking he's going to win. Oh. Well, between Borden's very successful anti-reciprocity treaty, handsome man, and look at this. This is what's going to happen. The core slogan, no trucker trade with the USA. Yes, yes, yes. And look at that. The US. What does the US have? Trusts. Trusts. You know what trusts are like. We don't have those in Canada. And look at that poor little Canadian interest. We're suffering. Poor us. Poor us. The certain result of reciprocity, hole in the line fence. Oh my God. All of our resources are going to be taken. We're going to become impoverished, completely dominated by corrupt American politicians. There you go. And you know what? It actually works. Of course, it's not a lecture in Canadian political history, but there's also a side deal done with Henri Bourassa, who's an autonomist politician in Quebec, where he actually sells out Laurier and actually does his own side in it as well. It's a very bad deal. But the Conservatives are going to come to power. Reciprocity is shut down. Anti-Americanism is won. Canadian economic nationalism is triumphed. And you're J.J. Hill. And this, as the French would say, was an énorme moment. This is not good. Because you have just set up your freight yards, you've been banking on reciprocity, and any smart betting man would have said you're going to have it. And now that's taken off the table. But still, in for a penny, in for a pound. You finish off your negotiations, you get that access. The only little problem is this. Hill and his companies want to start running the goods in immediately, right? The second they can. Because of all the delays in negotiation, typically these sorts of things, there's a minimum 30-day period for these sort of major deals to be signed off by all the principals. And it actually involved like 8 different companies. There's all these different moving parts. Oh, and by the way, yes, it then had to be ratified by the Canadian Parliament. There's no way you can get all that done in time to start running trains by May of 1912. Well, what if everyone, the lawyers get together and say, what if everyone says, we'll all agree as if our agreements are already in place as of this date. We'll act that way. And we're all in agreement, and so we'll just go ahead and act. And what do? Let's just send a quick telegram to the chairman of the Board of Railway Commissioners and get his approval on an interim basis for this deal. So they do. They send a telegram, April of 1912, to Judge, I believe it was Maccabee, who goes, okay, I coughed because he was quite ill. He dies within days. No problem. There's some sort of record of it, right? And then, and this is why I've read this as just a perfect storm. They start running the trains. And of course, now that the Hill and Trest are running trains from the US up into Winnipeg, they don't need the Canadian Northern Railway men to offload goods and put them onto Canadian Northern trains, right? There's no more transfer. It's a through line. 8 Canadian Northern Railway workers for Mackenzie and Mann, are laid off. They immediately go to the press and to the Premier of Manitoba, Roblin, and say, look at what this American company is doing to us. We are being displaced by American workers. Sweet suffering Jesus. Did I mention anti-Americanism plays? Especially after you've just whipped up a whole new maelstrom of anti-Americanism in that election of 1911. Everything is stopped. And now, what I, in larger work, refer to as what would have been a mere bureaucratic process of those agreements being signed off on, all of a sudden, it's a major cause célèbre. Because the Premier of Manitoba gets on the horn with his good buddy and former cabinet member, who's now the Minister of the Interior in Borden's government, and says, stop this deal. They don't have the paperwork. The whole deal is on hold. But trains have been running. What do you do? This labor situation is going to drag on for months. Now, they're going to have to agree to do exactly what the railwaymen want, which is stop using American crews for a while and offload everything and then put it back up onto Canadian Northern stuff. It's crazy. It's uneconomical. It makes no sense. This is not a happy entree into the wonderful world of Canadian railways for this branch of Hill stuff is the Midland. That's a problem. But then most of you probably know, 1913, I know we all think you're all waiting for me to say 1914 in the Great War, but something almost as bad happens. In 1913, Canada and the United States go into a major recession, major economic downturn just before the Great War. And then the Great War happens. Now, for those of you who are American, I'm assuming one or two of you are, the Great War did not start in 1917. It started in 1914, if you were part of the British Empire. Canada's at war. All of a sudden, the entire railroading regulation and every aspect of the Canadian economy changes. All of these railways that I pointed out to you, or I mentioned the Canadian Northern. I don't know where. Oh, it's way back at the beginning. The Canadian Northern is going to declare bankruptcy. The other, third Canadian transcontinental, the Grand Trunk Pacific, is going to declare bankruptcy. The government's going to take them both over, and at least in the case of the Canadian Northern, they didn't have to change all the initials on the train because the Canadian Northern became the Canadian National. No one could have survived this. It is a perfect storm. I argue, and I promise this is my final comment, that J.J. Hill made a series of very, very smart business decisions. No one could have predicted, A, that Reciprocity Treaty of 1911 would be defeated in an election. No one was predicting that economic downturn of 1913, and no one checked the newspapers and see the shock in people's minds when World War I broke out. Who was assassinated? Yeah. Exactly. And of course, I know everyone in Canada was going, doggone, I must now go and defend. No, of course. It's all those doggone interlocking treaties. People couldn't believe this madness. And I would also offer this one last thought, because I do think that, I hope I've proved that Hill was a pretty smart guy and certainly understood economics. I don't think anyone could have predicted what was happening. It was a perfect storm. But there's one thing about Hill. Now, he died in 1916. And I halfway suspect that if he'd lived, he might have figured a way out of this. I'm not sure, but it's possible. On that note, folks, I close. I'm sorry, you've been very, very kind to let me go a little bit long. Sorry. Thank you very much.